Hello and welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm here to inform you on today's session of what you want to know when you want to know it. Today, we're looking at designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solution as part of the Architect AZ305 course. This module is going to cover the authentication and authorization, two words that sound very similar that are two parts of a whole. And so we're going to go in and take a look at the way to prove who you are, the authentication, and then authorize you, or the authorization, to perform certain activities. Now, this is going to then tie back into what we did in module number 1 of this series, where we took a look at Azure governance. And we also saw that in other modules, we talked about this thing called Microsoft Entra ID. Now, depending on when you're watching this video, we've changed the name to incorporate Microsoft Entra ID. Previously, it was known as Azure Active Directory. But it's fundamentally changed at a core level. While Microsoft on-premises Active Directory domain services was this legacy-based NTLM process, when we went to the cloud, Azure Active Directory leveraged that great name that we had, but provided a new protocol when we took a look at OAuth and Open Data, WSFed, and some of those cloud-native, cloud-first technologies, and fundamentally changed authentication and authorization. This, again, is the next iteration of that, and we start moving towards what's called verifiable IDs. We're not going to get into it in this course, so this is going to provide, real grounding of the technology, but it's just that new name. So we're going to take a look at, what is a thing called a tenant and why you might architect one tenant or more than one tenant into your solution. We're going to take a look at variations of the Entra ID that you have. It can be a standalone identity provider that you're working with. It can be integrated with your on-premises world, providing backwards compatibility to your on-premises Active Directory domain services. You can configure a business-to-business relationship, and I'll do an example of that for you when we get to the demo. Or you can move all the way to a business to consumer model so that users don't even actually have to have an identity within your identity provider. They can use something like a Facebook account or an Outlook.com or a Hotmail Microsoft account, use that by a third-party provider that you're going to trust that authentication has taken place properly, but now you're going to be able to control how that authentication is then going to be authorized or granted access to do things inside of your environment. We're going to then take a look at this feature called conditional access. And this is one, for me, is a real game changer when you take a look at identity. And it moves identity from being a username and password, which we're probably all very familiar with, and it moves it to the concept of a thing called a persona. Because Bob, on a secure device managed by your organization that is patched on a secure subnet in a network that your company manages, accessing secure data that your company manages, it could be your drug research, is a completely different persona than Bob on his phone on a public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop trying to access that same data. So conditional access is going to provide you and your creativity to think about the different personas that individuals will use, that identity that they're working with. And you might have different constrictions and restraints that are put around those conditions based around the persona that person is performing at that moment in time. So we'll take a look at this thing called conditional access, something I'd strongly recommend that you feel comfortable with as an architect. Then we're going to take a look at ways to protect the identity. And whether it be multi-factor authentication, we're going to take a look at a thing called PIM, or privileged identity management, that allows you to now not have people over-provisioned. And so that I often will go on vacation, you'll end up meeting people, and somebody will tell me that, they find out I work at Microsoft, and they'll say, hey, I'm a, super high-level administrator at my company. I went, great, but you're on vacation. Do you still have those capabilities? Going, yeah, I can do it right now. Going, you might not want to do that. So we'll introduce some concepts to really kind of tighten what's called JIT, or just in time, and JEA, just enough administration. So that is all part of the privileged identity management piece. We'll then take a look at how you can now extend your identities, not just to users and devices that you've had in the past and groups. We're going to take a look at this whole new range of modern identities, where applications, and you can have what are called managed identities with system assigned and user assigned identities. And we'll introduce an area called Key Vault, where you can now store secure information like certificates, like secrets and passwords, and then grant access to those key vaults by granting, storing the information in there, and people have to be authenticated first to then be authorized to check out those secure information in the vault. So that's enough of the introduction. Let's get into the course material and look at identities and management of it. When you take a look at Azure as a cloud-hosted service, we had a fundamental transformation around what an identity is. In the past, we'd use the legacy services of Kerberos and NTLM, and a feature you might have heard of Active Directory Domain Services. And it was the predominant service in the industry for many decades. As we've moved to the cloud, we have cloud-native identity management services and a cloud-managed identity themselves. So I want to just take a look at what an identity is first so that we can understand what it is that we're managing. Within Microsoft Entra ID, you'll see that we have a service for identity management as well as resource management. If you were taking any of the other modules, we identified that service. When you take a look at identities themselves, and this is where it gets a little confusing potentially, because you'll see that there's some names that sound the same but are different. There's things that are sound different but are the same. So in this top center of the graphic, what you're seeing here is identity, or the term called security principal. In the Microsoft documentation, these two objects mean the same thing. So identity, the term I'll be using, and security principal are a generic term to represent some type of authentication authorization to uniquely identify something. Off to the far left-hand side of this, we have what are called user principals as a category of generically what I'll call legacy-based identities. Come on. Under user principals, we have users. User accounts you've probably used that have that are physical humans that identify themselves through some challenge response authentication process. We have groups that it's best to actually manage things using groups so that you can assign a set of controls or permissions to a group of individuals as opposed to doing this one at a time. We then get devices, and we've supported devices for quite a while, but in the past, it used to be only a limited set of devices. In the past, it used to be Windows domain joined devices only that we could use as part of our identity management platform. With our new Microsoft Entra ID and our cloud native services, we now have what are called registered and domain joined devices. And so joined is very similar to what we had before. It has a limited set of Windows devices that can support this, as well as the registered devices opens up to a wide variety of Linux, Windows, and iOS and Android devices. So you can have phones that are being registered. And so often, sometimes you'll hear the term BYOD, or bring your own device. So we've expanded the set of devices and the type of management that we can provide to them. We have a thing called an SPN, or service principal name, which has been around for quite a while. And so this is a way to be able to provide some kind of identity to things like maybe SQL servers or service things that you've got working. Now, service principal name sounds a little bit like security principal, but they're different. When you look at the right-hand side, you'll see that mostly what we're dealing with in here are these modern identities that you're working with, and they come under the term called service principals. Again, sounds a lot like service principal name as well as security principles, but service principals expand and broaden our concept of what an identity is. Applications can now have their identity, and especially as you move into a microserviced world, each microservice having its own identity is a very powerful capability to provide a very secure environment, as opposed to providing a common identity across a whole pool of applications. We can now distinctly characterize them and create what are called authentication flows. Below that, we have a series of managed identities. that are broken up into two categories called system-assigned and user-assigned identities. Again, just expanding what they are. We're not going to get into it in this lesson. And we have a set of legacy from the early days of Azure that are still available and supported, but we don't typically use them anymore. So what we want to take a look at in this identity management, as I said, is this broad range of capabilities that we can work with. Azure was founded on the concept of zero trust and a secure by default. What we mean by this is that in its initial deployment, Azure has been locked down. So no one typically, well, I should be careful, only certain people or identities have limited control by default. And it's up to you to open up the services of Azure to the other identities that you need to be able to do it. And you should only open it up to what they need to do. As opposed to in the past, you look at the old Windows servers, anybody could do anything anywhere. It was up to you to lock those services down. And who knew how to do that? Very few people could do it efficiently and effectively and to the totality that it needed to be done. So when we're taking a look at the zero trust, we want to trust no one but verify, or maybe trust but verify, depending on where you're from. But we then take that and we want to make sure that we're putting a whole set of controls in place to make sure that the identities that we work with, and you're seeing that on the right-hand side, we can have multi-factor authentication or MFA. You could grant limited access. You can actually have controls that block legacy authentication. You can force password reset. So there's all these different controls that we can put around our identity management and governance that we have. We have conditions that you can check for in this thing called conditional access, where I can see that you can be logged in because as a persona, Bob, a user at a company, has different personas that I have. I just don't have my username and password because that isn't a persona. My username and password being used on a secure device in a secure location to access secure data is a completely different persona than Bob on his phone in a public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop trying to access that same data. So, we want to be able to identify device types that you're working with. Are they compliant or not compliant? What is the condition that you're working in to be able to have this conditional access control that we work with? So follow this zero trust model. It's a new model for us to have across the cloud itself and really brings in a concept of being able to open things up in a limited value and provide, you'll hear terms later on called JIT, just in time, and JEA, just enough administration. So I often get into trouble when I go on vacation. I'll run into people and I'll ask them what they do. And someone will tell me maybe they're a high-level administrator at their database or at their organization. And I went, really? Are you have that permission to do so now? And they go, yeah, absolutely. Well, but you're on a ride at Disney. Why are you still having that access? So we really kind of get critical about just in time and just enough. So being able to do something only at the time you need to be able to do it, as opposed to carrying that permission around, after hours, is a potential attack surface. So when you take a look at what is identity and access management, these are those concepts that I've talked about. You can allow by role-based access control. That's that term RBAC, where you're going to be able to have roles that are defined that you're not granting permissions. The permissions come through what is called a role, and you define these very tightly controlled roles that, you don't need to be able to have full control to be able to do something. I only need to read permissions. And so I'm going to have a role that has the necessary read permissions across the scope of objects that I need to be able to have that information. You'll see that we also have this conditional access to be able to verify that you're working on maybe a secure device as opposed to an unsecure device. Has it met certain patch levels? And so you're seeing the two different pieces on the left-hand side of that slide. We have this identity management component that, Enter ID provides for us with this broad range of identities. And then we have all these new controls and management pieces that we can work with. Today, I'll be talking specifically about Azure architecture and governance relating to identity management. Let's get into it. When we get into identity management, we are considering the modern identities that are available to us in the cloud today. In the past, we had an on-premises world, predominated by Active Directory Domain Services, sometimes referred to as ADDS. And it was predicated on two foundational technologies, Kerberos and NTLM. Those technologies, while good, they had some limitations that even over the years and decades we've been able to patch and keep it fairly secure. There were some fundamental flaws that were hard to change. When we came to build a cloud-based identity, there is an industry standard that is based around new protocols referred to as OpenID, OData, OAuth, and WSFed. And those are the foundations for the identity management within Azure. We're going to get in and take a look at some of the characteristics. I'll do some whiteboarding and demonstration in just a minute. But what we have also is the capability to synchronize back to our on-premises environment through a connector so that it looks like a single identity platform provided to your on-premises and your cloud users. The modern identity protocols that we have provide a number of different services for us, and you'll see them referred to as a tenant and your IDs. We have the business-to-business relationship as well as a business-to-consumer. And so probably you've seen an opportunity where maybe you play a game where you can crush candies on your phone, and they have you log in with an identity from a completely different provider, but they take that authentication as an authorization of an identity, and then they grant you access to information within their application, in this case, the candies that you've crushed, and been able to give you data in their database that relates to your level and your ID that you have with regards to that game. So that's just sitting as a bit of a background. I'm going to do some whiteboarding and just kind of cover some of these major topics that we're dealing with. If you're familiar with the scopes within Azure governance, we see that you have this thing called a tenant. And the tenant is the highest level, and it becomes like a bucket or a container object that has a series of governance models that you see on the slide that are referred to as identity management, what we're talking about here, and resource management. We're going to focus in on the identity management piece. When we focus in on the identity management as the right-hand portion of this, slide that you're looking at right now, it is going to provide the authentication and authorization using these new protocols of OpenID and OData. OData is going to grant you access. Once you've been authenticated, we use a term called RBAC, or the role-based access control, that will grant you permissions to the resource management that you'll see on the left-hand part of the slide. When you take a look at the identities as a new protocol that we're using in the OpenID, it provides for a global communication and authentication process that allows for authentication within your tenant. It can also be used in a business-to-business relationship, where I, as a Microsoft employee, could come to your organization and you could validate my identity back at Microsoft and then authorize that to do services in your own organization. You no longer need to create an identity for me at your company. And what it provides for is a great security component that if I were ever to leave Microsoft, if you have an identity in your tenant, how do you know that I no longer work at Microsoft? But if I can't go back to Microsoft and be authenticated because they've removed me from their tenant directory, I won't be able to authenticate. And so you can trust that that identity is no longer a valid identity and will not have access to resources in your environment. The other things that we have capable for us, as I mentioned, there is a connector that we can work with that allows you to connect to your ADDS, or Active Directory Domain Services, and the domain controllers that you had. You would have identities that you've created that now could synchronize through this connector and create an equivalent identity for those users inside of Azure. It can synchronize passwords, and it gives you all the modern capabilities of conditional access, self-service password reset, conditional access that you would get from a modern identity supported within Azure's identity management piece. We talked about the business-to-business component, where you could now have an identity in your tenant that could be authenticated by a resource inside of another tenant. And you would then authenticate these users back to the identity at Microsoft in this case, that then would grant you maybe read access to the services in your organization. If a user is no longer available inside of that tenant, even though you granted it permission, it will not be able to authenticate back to Microsoft or whatever tenant that you're associating with to be able to gain access to those resources. So when you take a look at modern identities, we expand the scope in which those identities can exist in. I've drawn up, and we've got a lot of words that sound very similar, but may mean different things. And so you're seeing on the center there, we refer to identity management or security principles, are two terms that are interchangeable in this conversation. Down the left-hand part of the slide, what you're seeing is a set of what I'll refer to as legacy components that existed in ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services on premises. We have users in identity management in Azure, but they're authenticated slightly differently. It said one is Kerberos using NTLM, one is using this OpenID. We have device management, we have groups, but we have a whole new set of devices that are available to us now. In the past, devices had to be Windows devices that were domain joined. So it really provided for a subset of resources that could be managed as an identity. Within our new identity management within Azure, devices can be broader in its perspective. They can be domain joined or they can be registered. And by registering the devices, they no longer have to be Windows devices. They can be iOS, Android, they can be Mac, they can be Linux. So we have a wider breadth of operating system and devices, as well as the level of integration and management that we provide to them becomes much lighter. As a registered device, I have limited control over the device itself. One of the features that you might hear about is the ability to remotely wipe a device. If I owned it, if I could wipe the device if it was joined, but if it's registered, that's usually often referred to as a BYOD or bring your own device. I don't want you wiping my device. I want you maybe to scrub the data that you've made available to me on my device, and that's that limited control that you're working with. In the bottom left-hand portion, you're seeing an SPN or service principal name. That's been around for quite a while. Now that name sounds awfully similar to on the top of the right-hand side is you're seeing the term called service principals. Service principals is a general term in the cloud identity space where we now have several new types of identities that are available to us. Your applications can have an identity, and this really fits in line with that modern application development of microservices. Each application can get its own identity and be authenticated as an authorized application. Going down that stack, you see we now get a full range of managed identities, and they fall into two categories. There's system-assigned managed identities and user-assigned managed identities. They're slightly different. We're not going to get into it at this point, but one has a common life cycle that shares with what's using it, the system-assigned. They share that common life cycle, where user-assigned, they have a separate life cycle, and that identity can be used across a series of environments that you want to use that identity for. As well as we provide some early Azure identity management using that legacy ID. We don't often refer to it, but it is still supported in your model. So let's go off and do a demonstration and take a look at some of these features and some of these new identities that you have available to you. So we've talked about modern identities. We've taken a look at some of the characteristics of those modern identities, and I did a demonstration showing you some of the different types of identities and how they can be used within your environment. I encourage you to take a look at the broad range of Azure Active, at the broad range of identity and identity management that are available to us, taking a look at things like conditional access, self-service password reset, and privileged identity management that will allow just in time and just enough administration. Today I'm going to be talking about Azure architecture, and specifically, we're going to be taking a look at designing for Microsoft Entra business to business. Let's get into this. When you take a look at identity, there's been a fundamental shift as we've moved to the cloud. In the past, on-premises authentication and authorization was done using a technology called Kerberos and NTLM, and Microsoft presented that through a product that we had called Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. And you'll see that represented on the left-hand portion of the slide. As we moved to the cloud, there was decades of knowledge that we've learned to fundamentally change the way in which identities were looked at and used. And so with Microsoft Entra ID, identities are now presented with a cloud-native format using OpenID, OAuth, and OData. And so we now have this identity provider that is cloud-native. And there's the ability to connect that back to your on-premises environment so that we can synchronize our accounts between ADDS and the Microsoft Identity Provider in Azure. We're not going to get into all of that. Most of you might build that as what referred to as a hybrid identity. But we're going to focus on the right-hand portion of the slide. And I want to do a bit of an example of why this is going to be so important for you to consider in your architectural designs. If I go to a whiteboard here, what you're seeing is a representation that I have of the Microsoft public cloud environment. It's referred to as a multi-tenanted environment in which everybody is going to get a tenant with inside of the namespace of .onmicrosoft.com. And you're seeing that down below in the multi-tenanted environment. And so this becomes a unique space that you have within all of the multi-tenants of the public namespace. I've given some examples in here, and we'll use your organization as contoso.com, and your name might be contoso.onmicrosoft.com. And not in this module, but we'll show you how if you wanted to use your own name that you can publicly verify, you can get that as a replacement. But you're seeing on the left-hand side of this slide that Microsoft is in here, and we're even Microsoft.onmicrosoft.com as our tenant. Now, inside of your tenant, if you've seen in other modules that I've delivered, you'll see that we talked about resource management and identity management. What I want to show you is if I, as a Microsoft employee, came to your company in the past, what used to happen was, and draw an ID here, I've got an identity at Microsoft.com. I would come to your organization and I would check in and prove who I am by providing some identity verification, usually my driver's license. And what you've probably done is you've provisioned inside of your tenant an identity for me. And so you have your representation of Bob at your company. Well, that's great for the week or the 2 weeks that I might be working at your organization. You control it. You can give me access to the resources that I need. But what happens when I leave your organization and I'm not coming to you anymore? You still have an identity that you have to manage that is a potential attack surface. Another week goes by. My typical career at the past is I would go to another customer and they would create an identity for Bob this time at their organization. I would leave that organization and they have an identity to manage in their tenant that they're working with. Well, this became a bit of a challenge. What happens if I don't work at Microsoft anymore? You don't know that. What happens if I show up at your front door with my identity and say, hey, I'm Bob Tickleman, and you say, hey, come on in, Bob. I could do a whole bunch of damage. So you want to be able to fundamentally change this relationship with identities. And so what we're going to do is not have you potentially create an identity for me. We're going to create a relationship between the tenants themselves in this business-to-business relationship. And what you can do is several different formats of this. You can invite users in that they give you a credential that they want to tie to that. So in this case, I could sit there and give you my @Microsoft.com identity. You create an identity for me in your organization that is tied to that. Now, what happens if I were to leave Microsoft.com, I would no longer have that identity. And even though you have an invited user in that you control, it's no longer tied to a potential threat because I can't log in with my Microsoft identity. The new version that we're dealing with currently as the time of this recording actually provides you the ability to create a trust relationship. Going back to that on-premises world, if you're familiar with that, we used to have trust between domains. You can actually now trust the identity of the Microsoft account. So if I were to log in with my Microsoft account at your organization, I would go back to the Microsoft tenant, have Microsoft authenticate me at their site, And then you would accept that authentication, and it's still your control of your resources to say, yes, Bob can access these resources, but you're not actually going to be doing the authentication. So there's a series of options that we have available for us using Microsoft Entra ID currently to provide this business-to-business relationship. And this is what they're talking about, that, if Microsoft, and they do require me to use multi-factor authentication, I would still have to provide that MFA authentication for your environment. Or if you have different multi-factor authentication requirements, you could then enforce those on my identity at your organization. So this new business model with Microsoft Entra Business to Business provides for a much more secure model to be able to work with your identities. Today, I'm going to be talking about Azure architecture. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the design for Azure AD business to consumer. If you've taken the other modules, we've looked at a variety of different uses of the identity authentication process inside of Azure and some of the fundamental differences. I'm not going to get into those. If you want to watch those other modules, that'll be great. But what you're seeing here is a representation in the center of the authentication provider through a thing called Microsoft Entra ID inside of your tenant. We showed relationships that you can have back to your on-premises world through a connector that would allow you to provide that legacy authentication, what we called a hybrid identity, back to your ADDS or Active Directory domain services in your on-premises world. We saw that we had a business-to-business relationship potentially that is shown in that top right-hand corner of the slide that you're looking at. As more and more organizations open themselves up to a broader community, the formal relationship between a business to business may not be there, and you may have a business to consumer model. I'll give you an example that I use to describe this. Maybe I'm a company that, has built a game that crushes candies. And I give that product out there, and I've got a database of all the candies that you've crushed, and I've got the levels that you're at and all the scores and all that information. So that's my data. It's in my organization that I have. But if you're a consumer of this, I don't want to have to you create an account and all this difficult process. In this case, maybe I'll accept the authentication from a third-party provider. In this case, maybe I'll take it from something like Facebook or LinkedIn or some other third party, an Outlook.com account. So one of the public Microsoft identities that we have. And so by authenticating to that public entity ID, in the case maybe at, rjbt at outlook.com, which is my personal Outlook account, I could authenticate there. That grants me access to the data in your organization about how many candies I've crushed. And so I can continue to play that game. And so we have the capability to connect to a wide variety of these now cloud standard identities using that OpenID and OAuth model that we've mentioned previously, that would allow you to now create this business to consumer relationship. So there's technical reasons on how to do this, and we have courses that will show you how to set that up. But from an architectural perspective, it's important that you want to take a look at, do I want to expose myself? And then you build that into your architectural design. So you can have that pass through to open up to a broader community. And it can be done at any time. It can be done at the beginning of your architectural design. It can be planned for and then included in later on. And there's a whole series of security components that you may want to be concerned about as you get ready to implement that. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about Azure architecture. And on this topic, we're going to be designing for a thing called conditional access. Let's get into it. When you take a look at identities, we talk about a thing called personas. Because while I have an identity, something that is used to provide a thing called an authentication and authorization process through a challenge response, so I maybe give a username and password, and it maybe challenges me there. In other modules, we've talked about, including a thing called MFA or multi-factor authentication, where you might have to provide some biometric, maybe a token that you have on your phone or some kind of code that is going to provide this at a 2-level verification level. But still, the persona that I have might be varying depending on where I am and what I'm doing. So for example, Bob, as an authenticated user inside of your organization, on a secure company-owned device that has been patched and maintained in a secure network segment so that it's locked down and has all the necessary controls around your network security, accessing secure information is a completely different persona than Bob at a coffee shop on a public Wi-Fi on his phone trying to access that same data. And so conditional access is going to allow you to go through a multi-check, and it just depends on how complex you want these checks to be, to say, not only am I going to verify that the user ID is the necessary ID and password, but do they meet all these other conditions? Because I've worked at some very secure environments, and maybe you've got billions of dollars worth of drug research that you're working on. You don't want that information exposed. And so I've been in places where you can only view certain kinds of information in rooms with no windows in them, because literally there's people outside, like the old spy movies, with cameras hoping that somebody is going to open up some secure information on a laptop that might have a window next to them. So what we can now do is go through not just the authentication and authorization part. We can go through this conditional access. Do you meet all these criteria to be able to perform the activities that you do? So maybe my initial logon is fairly open. And as I try and elevate my activities to do maybe a restricted activity, it still will go through that check and say, hey, listen, you don't meet the criteria to be able to access this information. Now we want multi-factor authentication for you to do this. Or we're not going to grant this access to you because you're not on a secure device. So conditional access is a great way to provide a higher level of security in your architectural designs. Again, how you set this up and how you can configure it will be dependent by some very specific people that will think of all those personas that you want to check for as you go through this. In addition to the things I've mentioned, there's other potential risk factors, unexpected behaviors. So maybe I logged on here in the Seattle area, and then moments later I appear to have logged on in New York. That goes, that's kind of fishy. What are the chances of Bob logging in from two different geographic locations? Now, technically, it could be possible using a thing called a VPN, but that might flag a condition to say, maybe that isn't Bob, and I'm not going to allow that to take place. So there's all these different conditions. Get in and take a look at it, but I'd strongly recommend you take a look at conditional access and the definition of personas in your architectural designs for security. Today, I'm going to be talking about Azure architecture and specifically the topic of designing for identity protection. Let's get into this. Throughout a series of lessons that we've talked about identities and what they are, when you take a look at the conditions that we want to take a look at, we talked about authentication and authorization, the process and how do we set that up in a multi-tenant environment. We've talked about a thing called conditional access. The Microsoft Identity Provider has a series of other capabilities that we looked at. We've talked about adding a thing called conditional access in a previous unit, where you could create these things called personas that would identify a series of other features that you have to be able to get into or be able to pass to be able to perform an activity that you're looking with. When we take a look at identity protection, Microsoft has a whole series of best practice recommendations of how to set up things like you'll see on the slide there, a thing called break glass scenario. We've got to get away from administrators using their user account that they use to get their email like every other user, also being an administrator that is a high level that has these, very high permission sets within their identity provider. So identity protection is a series of switches that can be configured in Microsoft Entra ID to be able to set up these identity protections, create this thing called a broken glass or break glass scenario, to be able to recover some of the emergency activities you might want to take a look at. You can set things called risk policies. And what you're seeing there, the slide, it's a two-portion slide. If you look at the far right-hand side of it, there is what is the risk detection. So the first level is for you to define what are those risky activities that we might want to check for. Then what you do is you go into, is it a risky sign-on? So then we can set the criteria of what is a risky sign-on. I said previously in another module that maybe having a user account signing into two different geographic locations at or near the same time. So maybe me logging in, Seattle here, and then almost simultaneously logging in London, that would be kind of iffy to say, like, how did that happen? Unless you're in the Star Trek world and I teleported there. So you can create these. Is it a risky sign-on? And then what you have is that a risky user? And so this tiered approach, and what you're seeing on the center part of that slide, is you can now say, if I have a risky detection, and that's that far right hand of the yellow triangles, the far right hand side says, yeah, it's a risky detection, but it's not going to trigger the identity protection to say, yeah, we'll not classify you as a risky user. Moving that over one to the left, here we have a risky detection that is going to flag you as a risky user. So whatever that condition might be. And what you're now seeing is the third bubble over, the one in the center, you have a risky detection with a risky sign-on that then classifies you as a risky user. Or the final one is it's a combination of risk detections. I used an example in a previous lesson where I said, am I signing on in a public Wi-Fi on my phone and I'm trying to sign in? Is that going to classify me as a risky user? And we can send all this data through conditional access or to some other security information. You'll often hear this term called a SIEM. We have those capabilities in Windows Defender, as well as Microsoft Sentinel in Azure. All of these are these high-level security administration capabilities you have. So take a look at implementing identity protection along with all the other identity protection features that we've talked about in this series. Today, I'm going to be talking about Azure architectures and specifically a feature in identity on designing for access reviews. Let's get into this. When you take a look at identities, a recommended practice is you do not deal with an identity on a per person basis. People may change in the organizations, but roles rarely do. And so it's been long a standard at Microsoft that we recommend that you don't assign permissions, now what we call roles in the RBAC model, to individual users. You should assign them to a role or a group. And so now I'm going to have maybe a group for HR managers. I may have a group for HR users. I put individuals into those groups and I assign the roles to the groups. And through that group membership, you're going to get the permissions or the capabilities that are assigned to the role that is assigned to the group that you're a member of. So that's been a long standard for many organizations. You might be doing that hopefully right now in your own organization. But what happens after the fact? What happens if Bob leaves the organization? And you'll see this all the time, that maybe they disable the account while you've left, but you're still an account and you're still in that group. And I have a requirement at Microsoft as I've gone to customers that, I've been granted access. I might have to go back in and see if I still have access. And that's happened a number of times where, years after I've been at a customer, I'm still able to log in to our accounts and access information. I haven't been there for a while. So having this access review capability through our identity provider in Entra ID is the ability that you set up these conditions to say this group membership needs to be audited or verified on a regular basis. And so what you can now do is go through and say once every 6 months or once every, couple of weeks, however the membership might be sensitive to. It will then either say you as an individual, as a member of this group, you must verify that you still need to be a membership in that group. And through self-attestation, I can say, yes, I'm still a member of a group. I still need access to that information. And you can accept that. You can set it that says not only do you have to attest to it, you need to be verified by maybe the owner of the group, or maybe it goes directly to the owner of the group. You can also set conditions that say, if it's not verified by a specific day, take them out of the group. And so all of this access review would be a great process to include in your architectures, and then have these reviews applied to all these groups to make sure that people are not accidentally over-provisioned. So definitely recommend that you take a look at access review capabilities in the identity features of Azure and include them in your secure posture. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about Azure architectures and the topic of design service principles for applications. Let's get into it. When you take a look at this concept of identities In the past, we've had a very limited scope in which an identity was perceived as. We had user accounts, we had group accounts, we had device accounts. And it was very hard to, at the application level or some other obscure construct, to be able to validate who that user is. In the past, we've been able to work with things like certificates to be able to provide some of that authentication or authorization capabilities. But within Entra ID and the identity providers of the cloud, we now have this broader perspective, and it gets very important to think about this as we start to get into a lot of the cloud design and features. We've talked about previously a feature called microservices. And so I'll just want to show an example of this. If I have a microserviced application, and so I've got 3 levels here. We've got a front-end based application. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner, a www, maybe web page. So that's my web page. It's an application. It's a microservice. I maybe have a shopping cart feature of my web page. I've got some other features that are on that end user system of engagement. I've got a business middle tier that might take some of those front-end requests and then move them to the back end, those square boxes on the bottom, into my data tier. So each one of those is an individual part of my application. Now, in the past, if I was dealing with a monolithic application, what we typically had as a problem is we would assign an identity, possibly, to the entire application. So you might have assigned an ID to the entire application. The problem with this is that identity can be used across the entire application. And we had problems in the past where people might have a little search button on their front-end web page, and through a thing called SQL code injection, they potentially could use the ID of this high-level application to compromise the data in the database. Well, what we want to be able to do in a microserviced environment is I want to provide an identity for every single part of the application potentially. And so now, as an application, it might only be granted read permission to be able to read the database. And so even if you could try and do a SQL code injection, you're not going to have the capability to actually go in and then modify the data itself. And so this concept of being able to expand our understanding of what an identity is going to be foundational to the topic we're looking at today. So when we take a look at this construct of identity as I've described, down the left-hand part of the slide, you're seeing those traditional user principles. We have the user accounts and groups. Under the Microsoft Identity Provider in Azure, we're going to have a whole new set of identities that we're going to cover in this unit, which is on the right-hand part of the screen. We take a look at these things called service principals. And you can have a service principal assigned to an application. Now, this application can be in the cloud or on premises. We won't get into how to design that through a proxy feature. Or we can use this thing called a managed identity, and that's the topic we're taking a look at today. We can now have these managed identities that come in one of 2 formats, either as a thing called a system assigned or a user assigned identity. And those are the features we want to take a look at in this unit. So from a perspective of what it is I'm trying to do, I want to take an application. Maybe it's a virtual machine that's running the application. Maybe it's one of the app services in my app service plan. Maybe it's a function app. Maybe it's a container app. Doesn't matter. It could be one of those microservice. It could be a monolithic traditional application. If it's running in Azure, we can assign it potentially either an application ID, if it's on premises or in Azure, or we can assign it one of the managed identities. And so now what I can do is, as opposed to having a user account assigned to it, I can have a user use the application. The application also has an ID that then accesses some information like the data in the database or maybe another application in my microservice architecture. It's not in this slide set, but there's a topic called flows, and we take a look at an identity using a service that also has an identity trying to access something. These flows, we can set them up different ways to say, if Bob has read-write access, but he's using an application that has only read access, the least permission will apply. So I have a user that has maybe some high-level access being controlled through an application that also has an identity that says, hey, listen, if you're using me, I can only use this from a read perspective. or vice versa. Maybe you have a microservice application that has read-write to do something, and a user comes in with read-only permissions. The least permission is going to prevail, so that I can control the flow that say a user with read permission will only be able to read. But if a user comes in and has read-write, I'm going to be able to give them this higher level because I too have that capability. So this whole managed identities provides this concept going on to working with the different flows and providing a higher level of security through our deployment. I mentioned back on my slide that I brought in these concept of managed identities. You remember down that right-hand side of this slide, it talked about, we had applications, we had managed identities, and they came in those two formats. A system-assigned managed identity, and it's a strong recommendation that you look at using that, has a one-to-one, or a thing called a tight coupling. One deployment of a system-assigned managed identity to some service or some application, they have a tight coupling. There's a one-to-one relationship. And they live and die together. And that's where you see that second box on life cycles. They share a common life cycle. They get created together. If one gets destroyed, the other one gets destroyed. So it provides a real kind of a management perspective from being very clean, that if one disappears, it's not going to leave a lingering identity. When you take a look at the right-hand side of that slide, the user-assigned identities are slightly different. They have a one-to-many relationship. We use these sometimes in virtual machine scale sets where I can have as little as one virtual machine scaling out to potentially 1,000 virtual machines running in there. I want an identity, but I want all of them to use the same identity. So this way I can have a managed identity that is user assigned and it doesn't share the lifecycle. They're managed independently from each other. Or maybe I have two different services that I want to share that identity across. So there's a number of other features that talks about, the differences between them, but that's really the big one. And where possible, the system assigned managed identity is probably the preferred one to take a look at. I mentioned that also you had the capability to assign applications an identity. Now you can use a system assigned managed identity for an application, but the application typically goes through for, some of those legacy applications you're having, or maybe something that's not running on premises, or maybe something that's not running in the cloud. It's maybe running on premises. And so what we have is the ability to register an application to be able to have an identity that we could then control and manage it through the Azure identity provider. And I'll be doing a demonstration of that just in a few minutes. So we do have some recommended best practices. There's a number of other ones. These are the big ones that are out there. I mentioned wherever possible, you want to use a system assigned managed identity to have that common lifecycle management. We want to validate that the identity has only the necessary provisioning that it needs to be able to perform the activity. We don't want to grant it high level access to be able to do something. Kind of a common case that used to happen as developers might develop an application in their, sandbox environment. They might have these high level permissions that they use everywhere just because it makes it simple. But as we start to move that application through the different environments of test and QA and into production, you may want to start locking that down so that it only has the necessary permissions that it needs to be able to perform the activity you're looking at. And you go back where I started this whole thing, it really sets up that concept of flows that, you don't want to have these applications have these high level permissions. That way we can't control anybody's use through there because someone comes in and has access to it. They may be able to take advantage of those elevated permissions. Today we're talking about Azure architecture, and specifically in this unit, we're going to take a look at designing for Azure Key Vault and the features it provides for you. Let's get into this. We've been talking about identities through a series of other units. And we've talked about things that you can do from an identity perspective with creating managed identities and user accounts and groups. But we want to take a look at a feature called Azure Key Vault, the storage of this secure information. And as we go beyond just usernames and passwords, and we go into the certificates that you might have or secrets, there's a whole set of security components that you deal with. If you go back to the storage account unit, when we talked about securing a storage account, there was a thing called a SAS token. We need to be able to secure that information because putting that secure information into your code, not a good idea, or sharing that with other users, not a good idea, because what stops them from sharing that with other people? So what Key Vault provides for us is a common location that I can securely store secure information and then grant access to it, that you could come, and if you want to use that access, I don't get it because I have it and you gave it to me. You've granted me access. I'm going to come to the key vault, make a request to check that information out so that I can go use it in that secure location. And so Key Vault is a strong recommendation to store secrets and certificates and passwords, this secure information we're dealing with. I'm going to come back in just a second and explain some of the features that you have that you want to take a look at. But let's draw this up for you on a whiteboard. I want you to think of Key Vault similar to a security box, maybe at a bank that you might be working with. And so I'm going to set up a Key Vault as an object inside of Azure. So this is my Key Vault. Like all objects in Azure, it has a set of RBAC permissions, the role-based access control, that will grant you access to the object itself. And we've talked about things called roles that will grant you capabilities to read the Key Vault, to modify the Key Vault, to administer the Key Vault. And the ones we typically talk about are the owner, contributor, and reader. Those are the ones I'm going to be talking about, but we have very specific ones. You have the owner of a Key Vault as opposed to just the owner. So there's a wide variety of roles that I want you to make sure you look at before the ones that I'm just dealing with. And this gets into a construct called separation of control. So I want somebody to be the owner of the vault. That user has the capability to do everything to the vault. They can create the vault, they can delete the vault, they can change the permissions on the vault. They have everything to the vault itself. But as the contributor to the vault, you have the ability to use the vault, and you have the ability to maybe add things to the vault or take things out of the vault, but you cannot change the permissions of the vault. So it's a separation of control, and we would typically make two different users. Somebody builds the vault, gives the control to someone to use the vault, and then you have the readers who are there to consume the vault. The branch manager of my fictitious bank that has some safety deposit box, they can come in and contribute, maybe have some capabilities to manage all the safety deposit box, but they don't build the box. So somebody else builds the safety deposit box. The branch manager is the contributor that can manage the box. And then we have the readers that come in and consume the box themselves. Now, you're going to see back on the slides that this is one of the ways that you can control access to Key Vault and the vault itself. Now, there's a whole series of things that we can put into the vault. There are certificates. These come from your thing called a KPI or your they have things called PKIs or public key infrastructures. So I can store certificates in here. I can have what are called secrets. So maybe you've got something that is a long string of characters. So you have a certificate. You have a secret, and you have passwords. All of these can be stored in the vault. Now, it is a strong recommendation, you'll see this when we go back to the slides, that you use Key Vaults. There's no cost for the vault. There's cost for the consumption of the resources in the vault, the traffic in and out of it. And so one of the recommendations is you use a Key Vault by region, by application, by environment. So if I had an application that was microserviced and each part of it needed its own secure information, I would have a Key Vault for every part of the application per environment. So I would have one for production, one for dev, and one for test. So having lots of vaults is not a problem because we talk about what is the blast radius or the impact of a potential breach. If you put all your keys in one Key Vault and that vault gets compromised, all of the keys in that Key Vault is compromised. Anybody's familiar with that PKI infrastructure? It's very similar to the hierarchical structure that you would have built into your PKI. So within the Key Vault, there's also a set of things called policies. And policies control the read-write access to the objects in the key vault itself. And so I'll be doing that in a demonstration in just a few minutes of how you could manage access to the attributes in the vault, or the objects in the vault, by either using policies or RBAC. So hopefully that is going to help you understand the concept. But Key Vault, you'll see at the bottom, can be accessed through RBAC versus policies. We'll take a look at performance of some of the recommended practices. You'll see that come up where it says, you should have a Key Vault per product, per application, per region, per environment that you're dealing with. So let's go to the demo and show you how Key Vault works. Okay, so now that we've seen the variety of authentication and authorization capabilities for us, we've introduced the idea of Key Vault, we want to go in and see some of these things in action. And specifically, I'm going to focus around that conditional access, but we're going to do a demonstration of a number of these capabilities, and you can see how they play out. And really, it's up to you to be able to now layer this approach in your design of your solutions you're working with. So let's go to the demonstration. Microsoft Entra ID and all of the features that were talked about in this lesson encompass entire courses unto themselves. So if you're interested in more information about any of these topics, by all means, please take a look at the appropriate courses. But just taking a high-level review of some of the topics that we covered, coming into Microsoft Entra ID, we can then work with the different types of users. And we talked about users that are native to your tenant. And you can see that I have a whole group of users, but I've got some additional types of users that we mentioned in the lessons in here. Specifically, you can see that I've got an external Azure Active Directory account that is associated with another tenant. Now, I have a personal tenant inside of Azure where I manage my own personal family items. And so I've invited Bob at tickleman.com as a guest inside of this tenant. They would be authenticated by the other tenant, but they have a membership in this tenant that could be then added to groups that I could then control through RBAC permissions, grant resource access within my own tenant. The other type that I have available is I've got a Microsoft account. So this becomes a business to consumer type of account where this would have been a business to business. So this is one Azure tenant talking to another Azure tenant. In this account, we're using one of the Microsoft accounts, which we categorized as an Outlook.com, a Hotmail.com, MSN.com, or Live.com. So we've got third-party identity from one of those Microsoft accounts that has been invited. So this would be my RJBT at Outlook.com user that again has been invited into this tenant. A number of the services that were talked about in this lesson depend on the type of licenses that you're working with. You can see that I'm currently working with a Microsoft Entra ID free version. There is basic P1 and P2 that will activate some of the services that we wanted to show. When it comes to identity governance, there's several ways that you can get to the administrative consoles that we'll be using. Using the Azure portal and in the Microsoft Entra ID Blade, you'll see that I have identity governance. In here, there are some of the lifecycle workflows that we have, access reviews that are out there, privileged identity management. But I'm going to jump out into the Microsoft Entra Admin Center where I have all of those capabilities plus a few more. I can deal with my users and groups and devices much like I had in the Azure portal. I get into my application registrations, roles and admins, billings. But under protection, we get this feature of Security Center that I'm now going to be able to manage a wide variety of the security features that were talked in this module. Some of them were looking at authentication methods, multi-factor authentication, and risky users and risky workload identities, and then risky sign-ins, which we showed you how to classify these different uses of identities to identify risk and what kind of authentication might be required, maybe elevating people to multi-factor authentication, gain access to certain resources. Getting into password reset, this is going to be that self-service password reset capability. Under identity governance, we have a lot of those features I was just showing you back in the Azure portal. Entitlement management, access reviews, privileged identity management, lifecycle workflows. These are all ways to manage in an automated method the use of user accounts, memberships in groups that get audited. The last portion I want to show you is back in the Azure portal, but scrolling down under Microsoft Entra ID, and security, this is where I'm going to be able to take a look at conditional access, identity protection. There's that security center that we showed you in the admin center, identity security scores, named location, authentication method. As you can see in several places, these can be done either in the Azure portal or the other tools, but I want to take a look at the conditional access. This is where I can now create access policies, but you can see it needs a Microsoft Entra ID premium account. But this is where you could create conditional policies that we talked about that listens to those signals to say that are you in a secure location on a secure device to be able to access something? Do I need to elevate to a multi-factor authentication capability to now be able to access this? But those conditional accesses would then be configured, and that would allow you to configure those personas. Let's go back to the lesson. Welcome back from the demo. Really want to focus on, while we talk about the various types of ways that you can configure your Entra ID environment, we really want to take a look at that thing in the first module, or the first lesson we had in the module around. You really want to start with a single tenant wherever possible. The more tenants you have, people think it's going to give them more protection, and in many cases it's actually not going to do that, because it broadens what's called your governance model that you're working with. So as a starting premise, you want to start with a single tenant and then start working with that, and then find reasons not to use it. And if you remember the demo and the lecture, I gave you some examples that might be conditions that would allow you to go away from that single tenant. We then took a look at the various ways that you can configure your Entra ID environment, in that standalone, integrated with your on-premises environment, a business to business and business to consumer. We spent most of our time taking a look at the IDs and managing them with that privileged identity and conditional access. And then we showed you a small piece of the key vault and how identities play in conjunction with them, that we needed identities to create the key vault and consume resources in it. And then there was a set of permissions to actually gain access to the secure information inside of the vault. And we saw how all this layered approach, and it's all founded on the Microsoft documentation around what's called defense in depth. And this is just a small portion of the depth of your permissions that you want to take a look at. You want to have this multi-layered approach. So absolutely a great big part of your design for an Azure-based deployment, but also a huge part of making sure that it is safe and secure in the deployment of that environment. So that's the lesson for identity management, huge piece. Make sure that you've got it in place first, and you'll have a secure by default, because that's what Azure is. And then you want to assume breach to make sure that you only open things up for people to be able to use them, as opposed to trying to lock them down after the fact. So thanks very much for paying attention. I look forward to seeing you at a future lesson.